So hello sword friends, this is going to be a re-upload of the previous video where we were talking about Katana versus Rapier and all of the historical accounts. I just wanted to improve the quality of the video. However, I'm going to be adding on another account that I happened to find that has a very interesting tale of Japanese and Portuguese together. Looking back at the end of the 16th century, we go to 1595 and it's a Portuguese account taking place in Cambodia. And here we're going to be talking about soldiers in action, hearing about shields and swords being used. They're going to refer to the Cambodians here as Indians. So I'll just jump right into the account. It says, as we stood at the entrance of the street, attacked from all sides, a troop of brave Indians charged towards us through the street, wielding swords and shields. They had lost their fear of our gunfire, even though they zigged and zagged through the street to avoid being hit, as it made aiming more difficult. Their captain came so close to us, just a few more steps, he could have slashed us with his katana, which for this purpose are so well suited that not even bone resists them. Yet considering how exhausted we were, it would have taken a lot for him to draw blood from us, as we were almost frozen with fatigue. Sounds like a pretty bad state. I truly confess that I wanted to go out and face him, not because I thought I could kill him, but because I wanted to be the first among us to die and not witness the slaughter that they intended to inflict upon us, or worse, if they captured us alive. But after reconsidering, I told Sergeant Blas Ruiz to attack him with his halberd. He went out and did so with such bravery that even though the Indian shielded himself with his shield, he pierced both his shield and his body with a single thrust. Soon after, about 12 Japanese men who were with us arrived and cut them to pieces, so that the magical charms that they carried, which gave them such confidence to enter among us, did them no good, as they thought they were quite safe. So there's an account where we have Japanese and Portuguese fighting with swords, although on the same side, not against one another. So it's close, but we still don't have the duel yet. I'll keep looking, sit back, and enjoy the rest of the video. Hello again, sword friends. It's here to make a reply video to Matt Easton of Scala Gladiatoria and Dave Rawlings of London Longsword Academy. The guys have made awesome videos. Please go and check them out. I'll make a link to them below on a great topic that everyone wants to talk about, Katana versus Rapier. So this is something that's of interest to everyone because it's a really interesting point in history when Japan, which was historically closed, for centuries and centuries, its borders were closed, but for about 100 years, it was open and engaged in trade with Europe, and we had arms that came in, and arms and armor were incorporated into Japanese culture, and we had goods that went out away to other parts of Asia and even as far away as Europe from Japan. And so everyone wants to know what happened when the Portuguese, the British, the Dutch encountered these Japanese warriors. So I've decided to add my own 2 cents to the conversation by providing some historical accounts that are prescient to the discussion at hand. I haven't yet found the gold standard that we're looking for, which is an actual documented account of a duel between a katana and a rapier. I'm looking for that, but so far in English I haven't found that. Maybe it still exists somewhere in Portuguese. So anyone who's listening to this that speaks Portuguese, please do some research. The closest I've found so far comes from a 1950s account from Boxer, Fidalgos of the East, and it reads as follows. Let's see what it says here. In either case, he met with a sticky end, for he, together with 14 other Portuguese, was killed in a brawl with the Japanese at Hirado in the year 1561. That season, there were no less than 5 Portuguese ships in Japan, one of which was commanded by a certain Alfonso Vaz, and went to Satsuma, where he was also killed in the port of Akune by some samurai. Specifically, it says samurai. Accidentally, according to Shimada Zu, the local daimyo. These are the first recorded armed clashes between Japanese and Europeans. So that's an account from the, middle of the 16th century, and it explicitly talks about the samurai getting into it. And obviously it did happen as they're in there trading and trying to navigate differences in social norms and drinking in bars and trying to not run afoul of local warlords. Obviously, it happened, and so we'll see if anyone can find an actual written source either on the Japanese side or on the European side of what we're all interested in. But we're here to talk about swords, of course. So I have gotten ahead and taken a look at some of the encounters to deal with who's going to win, who's going to come out on top. So there was a little bit of a discussion as to if a katana could defeat a rapier. So quick definitions out of the way. Both of those terms are easy to mistake what swords we're actually talking about. So if we're first talking about the Japanese side of things, when people are interested in looking at a katana, it's very easy to engage in synecdoche and call everything a katana. For one, if we're strictly looking at, yes, katana, the character does refer to almost any type of blade, but everyone really means uchikatana, the longer of the two swords worn by samurai, especially during the Edo, the shorter one being a shoto or wakizashi. But there is a large spectrum of different types of blade design. There are blades that are narrower in, or thinner, I should say, in cross-section, that are better for a civilian context where you're dealing with less resistance and very good at cutting. These are the type of blade profiles you see in tatami cutting, for example. But there are also blades that are used in times of war of all types, even the longer tachi, the shorter wakizashi, the kodachi, that have what is called a lot of niku, or meat, on the sides of them. They're still very, very sharp, but they are more durable and more resistant to being damaged by the things that you encounter on a battlefield. They might be a little bit more difficult to strike lighter targets like tatami cutting with, so which is why you wouldn't see them in the type of tatami cutting competitions. So that's one thing to keep in mind, what type of sword you're discussing. If you're talking about the 17th century, the 16th or 17th century, you're more likely to find a more civilian style katana than the earlier, longer tachi that were more robustly built. That's one thing. On the European side of things, the name rapier is a wastebasket taxon. Almost any sword is called a rapier regardless of what type of blade, and a myriad of different types of hilt configurations. So there's long blades, there's short blades, there's wide blades, there's thin blades, there's blades that can cut, there's blades that can't cut at all. Matt Easton just showed a lovely sword from L.K. Chen, the Saxon, which has a blade wide enough to be an arming sword that's put on a rapier-style hilt. So again, we have to think about what type of sword we're discussing when we're talking about a rapier, and it's made even more confusing because if you're trying to do this research that I'm doing and looking at the actual period sources, in most of the cases they're not using the term rapier at all. They're just calling it a sword, which is what almost any of these weapons would have been called in period. So for the purposes of what we're discussing, we're talking about thrust-centric, very long-bladed swords that have complex hilts. There's going to be a spectrum still, so side swords and rapiers are very closely related and will have a large degree of overlap, and they'll eventually turn into small swords, and you have things like the Spanish taza that have a cup hilt and have no edge on them that fall in there somewhere. But for the most part, we're talking about things that develop maybe around 1570 or so. They probably take on their proper shape and will continue for the next 150, 200 years, depending on what part of Europe we're looking at. So to that end, I have a couple of accounts for us from both the European side and then from the Japanese side. Now, to answer the question of which one will win in this contest of steel wills, I've decided to look at their points of failure. So I have come up with just a handful of things that we can look at that will talk about blades breaking. Now, again, that won't tell us all of the story, but it's kind of interesting to see when it documents under what circumstance a blade will break. That kind of gives you an idea of the expectations of what the sword could do and couldn't do. So here's a couple of accounts. The first comes from Italy. So from 1570, from 1570, we have Giacomo di Grassi, and he discusses, this is part of one of his treatises, which he discusses several different weapons. Specifically, he's talking about rapier and buckler here. And so he's talking about how the buckler can be constructed and used. So, de Grassi says, as concerning his greatness, standing still on the form of the buckler, by how much the greater it is, by so much the better it voids the blows. But it is to be regarded that in hinder not the eye, sight, or at least as little as it is possible. Besides this, there is required that about the middle thereof there be a little strong circle of iron, well nailed and hollowed from the buckler, so that between the circle and the buckler the sword may enter, by means whereof a man may take hold fast of the sword, or break a piece of the point. But this is done rather by chance than by any rule may be given how a man should take hold and break it. For the sword comes not with such slowness, and is such quantity of time as requisite in that behalf. So he's saying you have your buckler, you have a little hole, and you have a piece of iron on it, and the sword is supposed to be able to come through, and you're supposed to be able to either grab it or snap it. So a quick point. Here I made a mistake where I thought that the rapier blade entered the part of the buckler, and then you grabbed it with your other hand and snapped it off, which is why my wording sounds confused. Since then, Matt and Todd from Todd Cutler have shown off one of these bucklers and demonstrated that it's, of course, a solid buckler. It doesn't have a hole in it. It's just there's a gap between the metal bars and the surface of the buckler itself. And so they're describing in the text that the sword blade goes in and gets trapped between the bars and the surface of the buckler, and then you can snap it there, which makes a lot more sense. You're just snapping it off with leverage. I wasn't very clear when I was describing that the first time. By presumably lodging in the buckler. So that's interesting, but he says you can't plan on it happening. The sword's not just going to come in slowly. It's just going to happen by chance. You just have to find the opportunity to take it. But still, just having a sword be having the tip grabbed and snapped, or having it lodged in a buckler and snapped. I have this Civil War era spadroon, and it comes down to maybe 1.5 millimeters, 2 millimeters here at the tip. It's got a cutting profile in profile and width, but it's still very thin, and it flexes without me being worried about its snapping there. So we're talking about a blade that is more fragile significantly than this very thin spadroon, as far as considering how delicate it is in the foible of the blade. So that is one account from 1570 from Italy. Then we have from England, Joseph Swetnam from 1617. What does he warn us? He says, also take heedeth that thou strike not with thy rapier, for so thou may break it and bring thyself to thine enemy's mercy, and it may be he will take the advantage of thee. So he specifically says, do not strike with your rapier, for it may break. That's a little bit different than what Dave Rawlings was saying, because Dave Rawlings was saying you may break your rapier if you try and oppose the longsword. In this case, he's talking about the rapier snapping as a result of striking. And I don't have it here, but he says if you have to strike, only do wrist cuts with the rapier. And that's really, really interesting. So we obviously, an opposing swordsman can strike with a great deal of force, and you're going to be able to mitigate how much of that force you have to absorb depending on what manner of block you engage in. However, when you're talking about the amount of force that a sword blade has to undertake, the most force, the most stress on the blade almost certainly is going to be when you're striking another target. Certainly, you can put a tremendous amount of force on the blade, especially a long blade like a rapier, if you just wind up with your entire body and lay into it. So this is something that I don't think that anyone has discussed up until this point. To be honest, I think that the largest chance that a rapier has of being cut by a katana would be if the rapierist was trying to swing as hard as possible and the samurai did a hard static block. That may actually be the situation under which the rapier is most likely to break. To be fair, Swetnam also was even-handed and discussed how swords, so not rapiers, but more standard type of swords, either basket-hilted swords or arming swords or cut-and-thrust swords, were equally likely to fail. So he goes on to say, "But I say, and by good experience I speak, if that he which striketh in fight giveth his enemy a great advantage. Besides, a sword may either bow or break, and so by that means he that striketh may fall into his enemy's mercy." So he was advising in using the thrust and trying to avoid giving heavy blows in this case. And he's saying that the swords that he had access to at the time, he obviously didn't have a lot of faith in the quality of the metal or the production of the swords that he had, because he felt that they might bow or bend or just break. So it's not just rapiers that he felt had this problem. It was swords of, I guess, almost any kind that Swetnam was concerned with in 1617. So that's true on the European side. What's going on the Japanese side? So we turn to the change in the development of Japanese blades. As mentioned, I mentioned before that there are different types of Japanese blade, and there are also different schools. There are different periods of Japanese production, and there's certainly different quality of Japanese swords. During the Ming Dynasty, there were thousands of swords being exported from Japan to Ming China, and at the beginning they were being paid top dollar for them. And as the centuries went along, from the 14th into the 15th century, the quality began to decline, so that Japan was having to increase the number of swords going over in order to get the same amount of money from China, to the point that it was becoming ridiculous. They were obviously producing, or sending over less and less quality grade swords as time went along. So there's a large spectrum of qualities from different schools, different smiths, just different periods of time depending on what we're looking at. I want to look at accounts by a smith. This section is going to test my ability to pronounce Japanese names. I've read them thousands of times, but forgive me, I'm not always great at pronouncing them. So we're going to start by looking at accounts being recorded by this smith from the 1700s, Suishin Masahide. He took special notice of what was going on in this Edo period, this time of peacefulness, and how the swords were becoming more and more elaborate and decorated, how the hamon, in particular, the hardened portion of the blade in our deferentially hardened Japanese swords, was getting wider and wider and more ornate, and this was leading to structural problems with the swords. So this is a record of his. We'll go through it here. It says, Masahide gained this knowledge empirically through repeated eyewitness accounts and reliable sources concerning swords in actual use. The following incidents that Masahide mentioned, in which blades with Hade style hamon were broken. So these are large style hamon. It is the following are the translation. So we're going to go through 25 accounts. If you can't sit through it all, you can skip ahead to the summary at the end. But I think that they're interesting, so we're going to go through each of these accounts to hear what was actually happening with swords in Japan during this period where we're transitioning from the Shinto area of sword production into the Shinto area of sword production. So, first one, Masahide was at the house of an Akimoto retainer. There was a thief that night. The retainer used the mune of the blade, so that's the back, the spine of the blade, to strike the thief. The blade broke in the middle, and the kisaki was knocked off. As a result, it landed on the rooftop of the neighbor's house. This was a katana by the Mizuta Kuneshige with an omidare ba hamon. Okay. So he struck the retainer with the back and the tip flew off all the way to the neighbor's house. Interesting. Number 2, a younger friend of the Akimoto retainer used the mune of the wakizashi to hit a dog. The blade broke in the middle and the dog escaped. Oh, that was a close one. It was a mume wakizashi by Echigo no Kami Kanasada with an omidare ba hamon. So, 2 accounts, and already 2 times we see them striking with the mune, the back or the spine of the sword. If you have seen Matthew Jensen, please go and visit my buddy Matthew's channel. You will see that he tests swords to failure, and a recipe he has for single-edged swords. He will abuse the edge of a sword, get nicks and chunks and cracks in it, and then he'll flip the sword over and strike the back of it onto a hard, immobile target, and just 1 or 2 strikes, and then it'll propagate a crack all the way through. This makes a lot of sense. Swords are designed in a particular way. If they're single edged, they have a very thin, often very hard, fine, keen edge, and they have a much thicker, oftentimes more flexible, softer spine to be able to absorb the impact of the strike and to be able to bend backwards. So this is meant to be stiff and go through the target. This is meant to be soft and flex backwards to absorb the shock of the blow. If you turn the sword around, it's all wrong. This is not meant to hit something hard. This is not meant to flex. This is all hard and brittle and is a recipe for ruin. So, number 3. In the Shitatani area, a retainer was fighting a merchant. The retainer's blade broke and his arm was cut. The retainer used a Shinto katana by Omi no Kami Suguriha with a wide hamon. The merchant used a Baizen Sukesada katana. Masahide witnessed this himself. Number 4. A Shitatani fencing teacher named Fujigawa was testing a blade by cutting a kabuto. So, we haven't talked about blade testing too much in Japan, but after a blade is produced, sometimes maybe it wasn't tested at all, but a lot of times blades would get certified, and you can see it sometimes written on the nakago, on the tang, that the blade was tested. Blades were tested using a variety of means. Sometimes they were tested on condemned people, on criminals. They were done by cutting through various body parts. Occasionally, you would have them tested through mats or rice straw. But the most prestigious type of testing to survive was against bits of armor, and one of these is kabutowari, so helmet cutting. So you'd have a helmet and you'd put it on a stand, oftentimes on a pile of rice, and then you'd go whack, and you were supposed to be able to make a mark on the helmet, and the blade was supposed to be able to survive intact. So an iron helmet. That was considered a real test of the smith's skill to be able to make a sword that strong. So that is apparently what's going on here. Let's see how this guy's sword does. So the fencing teacher was testing a blade by cutting a kabuto. the katana broke about 24 centimeters from the kasaki. So 24 centimeters is about one shaku, a little less than a foot. So it broke about there. Actually, the kasaki's back there, so about there. It was a Satsuma blade. Number 5, in the Shiba area, a martial artist named Akamatsu tested a katana on a kabuto, and the sword broke. This was a blade made by Ishido Kurakazu. In Inaba, a retainer was arguing with a Shinto priest. A katana was involved and broken. It was an Inaba Shinto sword. Number 7, a Satsuma area smith. Number 7. Satsuma area smiths tested their katana on thin metal plates. Now that is very interesting. So I think that a majority of modern sword collectors have an idea of what's considered abusive and not abusive, and what targets are okay and what targets are not okay. And most people would flunk metal. I occasionally see people going after, water bottles. Okay, that's fine. And even some types of plastic, you kind of worry, because plastic, not all plastic's made the same, and some plastic targets are quite thick and can kind of mess up your blade. Occasionally I see people going after aluminum cans, soda cans, beer cans, what have you. And I think to myself, okay, aluminum's significantly softer than steel. You'll probably cut through it fine, but I kind of get the heebie-jeebies because it's going to scuff up the sides of the blade, and you'll probably have to spend some time cleaning it up afterwards, depending on the type of sword that's involved. I have seen certain folks doing sword feats before. Obviously, there are things like historically there were lead cutters in the 19th century. That was a fun sword test done with big heavy swords. And I've also seen on Japanese television guys who have performed cutting of very thin pieces of metal, either pipes or sheets of metal, using katana. And of course, we know from anime, the katana can cut through huge pieces of metal. This is the first time I think I've heard of anything, before the industrial age, of swords being tested on metal. I could be wrong, but I don't know that Eisenhower as a sword concept goes back that far. Please correct me if I'm wrong, if you know of other accounts of swords being tested against cutting pieces of metal that go back into the 17th century or 18th century. Please let me know. Let's see what happened. The smiths tested their katana on thin plates of metal, and the blades were broken. Didn't work this time. Number 18, Kobayashi Masaoki, a student of Masahide, made a katana with a big hamon pattern for a retainer of Echigo. The blade broke when hitting stone statues in the garden on the Mune side. It shattered like an icicle. So once again, striking with the back of the blade, and it's very colorful how they say it shattered like an icicle. So again, if we talk about an area being of very hard, and sometimes these edges will be significantly above 50 Rockwell hardness, so up to 60 plus Rockwell, depending on the individual blade. You might have a soft back, but if you have hardness, if you have it that brittle, once it breaks catastrophically, you may end up with multiple pieces flying out rather than just a clean snap. So for it to describe as shattering like an icicle, that must have been quite the failure to have seen. Number 9, an Awa retainer was testing blades by the order of the lord of the Hachisuga family. He tested blades made by Shinkai, Echigo Kanasada, Osafune, Sukesada, and Masahide. During the Mune testing, so testing on the back, the blades that had big hamon patterns were all broken. The ones with small hamon patterns developed ha-giri. So ha is the edge, and giri are little nicks or little cuts.
then it says parenthetically, on the battlefield, this is highly preferable to breaking in half. However, some of these were broken too. So none of the wide hamon pattern blades survived, and of the small hamon pattern blades, it sounds like most of them survived. A couple of them broke, but hagiri developed. So they're striking them again in the worst possible way, and it sounds like micro fractures are starting to develop. But they specifically mentioned this is what they want to see, because in a battlefield situation, if you accidentally overstress your sword, what you want is for it to be able to absorb it and say, ah, and your sword can be damaged, and that's fine, but at least you still have a sword. You don't want the sword to just catastrophically fail, and then you don't have a sword. So that's what they wanted to see, and the ones with the small hamon are the ones that survived. Number 10, a family in Shinano had collected more than 150 pieces of broken katana, yari, and naginata from battlefields in the Koto period. So talking about collecting old period blades. That's all that it says, though. Number 11, an Okayama retainer named Watanabe was doing a cutting test on the lower part of a corpse. So just as we mentioned before, probably cutting the bodies of criminals. The katana broke at the monouchi area. It was a seki blade. So the monouchi is the upper part, the striking part of the, essentially the foible of the blade, just before the kisaki. Number 12, a bandit attacked the leader of Okayama retainers. The leader used the Mune side of a katana to fight the bandit, but it broke. Then he picked up a bamboo stick and continued to fight. Eventually, he was able to defeat the attacker and use a rope to tie him up. When the retainer checked the bandit, he found wounds caused by the bamboo stick, but none by the katana. He couldn't help but laugh at the situation. Okay, yeah, that's pretty entertaining. So again, it's very interesting seeing everyone's. This is an interesting concept. So everyone's still using the back of the blade, and you know, we have in North America the concept of counting coup, where you run up and tag someone in the middle of battle. But we're seeing again and again people unwilling to use the sharp edge of the sword in what are very bellicose circumstances. A surprising number of times. Perhaps, again, there are legal ramifications where they don't want to be on the hook for actually bringing lethal force against the opponent or accidentally killing them. But it's surprising to see exactly how frequently the backs of these swords were being used, and unfortunately it looks like they didn't hold up very well. Also interesting, don't undersell the usefulness of a staff weapon. So all you quarter stick practitioners, all you jo and bo practitioners, hey, a good strong stick is apparently more effective even than the blunt side of a saber. Keep that in mind. Number 13. An Okayama retainer got into an argument with a person on a ferry. He drew his katana and made a cut. The blade caught the wooden pole of the boat and broke at the monouchi. Ouch. Poor katana. Number 14. A bushi from Mito was doing a cutting test on a skull. Presumably this is not a skull inside of a person, if they're just saying a skull, which means it is probably dried out and a lot harder than in the vital state. The bone will ossify and not be as soft as in living tissue. The katana broke. A Mito swordsman was fighting with a bushi. His katana broke about 27 centimeters from the kisaki. It was a Haizen mono with hiro, wide suguha. Masahide documented the above examples. Okay, so it doesn't, there are just two examples for number 14. Okay. Then it says, Takahiro, an Oshu retainer and a student of Masahide, recorded the following examples. He worked with Masahide on developing the theory of Nihonto functionality and publishing Masahide's research. Okay, so we have some bonus 10 examples from Masahide's student. Number 15. 5 newly made yari by Edo Smith were broken during a wild hog hunt. Huh, that's interesting. I don't research yari very much. I'm a sword guy, but we have the concept of the wild hunts in Europe, and we have big boar spears and things like that. I don't know much about weapons being broken in European hunts, but this is the only time I've heard of yari, and no less 5 yari, multiple yari being broken during a wild hunt in Japan. Very interesting encounter. Number 16. During a fight in Gunma, one combatant used a Mizuta Kunishige katana and his opponent used a well-made naginata by Satsuma Masakayo. As a result, both were broken. Now that's also fascinating. So you have a katana being drawn against a big polearm. I'd normally give the advantage to the polearm in that sort of a situation. And it doesn't say exactly what went wrong or how badly each of them fared. It just says both were broken. So we don't know the result. But I think that there is sometimes an over representation of pole weapons and archery and the like, and an underrepresentation of sword use in sort of a battlefield context. It doesn't specifically say that this is a battlefield, it just says a fight. But this is a situation where someone had access to a polearm and someone else drew a katana, and obviously they went up against each other. So interesting to see. Number 17. In the Fujioka area, a Mito family ken was being tested with a katana. A ken, or a tsurugi, is a straight double-edged Japanese sword. So much like the here. This is my makeshift ken. So this is a Chinese gen from sword maker L.K. Chen, but in the Heian and earlier period, Japan would use double-edged straight swords, and starting around maybe the 8th century or so, they were retired from martial use. So these were no longer used as battlefield weapons, but they continued to be produced mostly as religious shrine swords, but they were occasionally kept as swords that were had as family heirlooms. So they were continued to be produced by actual reputable smiths. They just weren't used as weapons of war for the most part, at least as far as I know. So let's see what it says. An Ego retainer practiced fencing with his son who used a ken. The retainer's katana broke. It was an Ishido Korakazu. So that's fascinating. Not only was the ken being used for fencing practice, but they were both using apparently live blades. So that's sometimes a question that's asked, do you ever practice fencing with sharps? Normally you would say no, you wouldn't use sharp blades to practice your swordsmanship because the risks are too great. You're going to hurt one another. You're going to damage the swords. This is an account where it happened at least one time, very unusually with a tsurugi, a ken, in addition to the katana. And what happened when they practiced? One of the swords was broken. So an unusual account all around. Number 18. A bushi named Nagai used the mune of his katana to hit the shikii of a house entrance, so the threshold of the house entrance. The blade broke into 3 pieces. It was a katana with a big hamon, patterned after Kawachi no Kami Kunisuki. Number 22. An ego retainer used the backside of the kisaki to hit the hand of one of his servants. The monouchi part of the katana broke off. It was Mizuta Kunishige. Okay. At number 23, an ego retainer fell from a horse and his blade broke in 2. Uh-oh. Bad times. It was a Setsu no Kami Tadayuki. Number 24, last one. An Oshu retainer was paying respects in a temple, and for some reason his blade bumped the Ishidon, the stone rock steps, and the blade broke in 2. This sword was from the Nao Yamashiro no Kami family. It was a Koto Bizen with Choji Midari Hamon. The retainer had the remaining part of the blade made into a wakizashi about 40 centimeters long. Well, that is very interesting. So that's some insight as to the sorts of things that were going on with swords of the period that we've been discussing between katana and rapier. Obviously, the invincible, indestructible katana was prone to failure. Now, it does sound like many of these accounts, the swords were being used in what we would consider abusive fashion. It was going up against stone in some cases. It was being struck on the back of the blade. And as Danny just mentioned, it was good smiths did test their blades that way to try and show that it was durable enough to survive those type of strikes, but it's still not the intended use of the sword, so that's a way to give it additional stress. But it's still possible that even a well-made sword could have a catastrophic failure, and the swords of this period are thinner with wider hamon than earlier swords that have thicker cross sections and have thinner areas of very hard cutting edges. So where does this leave us with our rapier question? I think that it's pretty easy to say that it could go either way. Either of the blades could fail, and you can't really predict that one is going to beat the other. Either one could have an off day and break in a fight between one or the other. If we did 1,000 trials, I would probably say that we're going to see more failures on the side of the rapier based on what we've just discussed, comparing the nature of the two swords. The rapier is a lot thinner. I don't think that what's going to happen is the katana user is going to be able to ever cut through the rapierist's blade. Any good rapierist should be able to mitigate the effects of that blow. But again, lucky strikes could happen, and the same could be true the other direction. It might be that at some point the rapierist is striking against the katana and the katana could break. So that sort of exchange is very difficult to know what's going to happen when physics takes over and these pieces of metallurgy and smithing skill come impacting at real high velocities. It's almost impossible to predict what's going to happen, and that's part of why we do these experimental archaeology and we get out there and actually test things. I'd love to someday be able to actually go and test this on an actual real sharp rapier. Hopefully there's some smith out there that's able to produce maybe a blade blank, a nice long, thin, sharp rapier that I can just clamp in a vise, and we can just go at it and see exactly how much abuse it can take. Maybe it'll take just one good solid blow and the tip will come right off. Maybe it'll take 100 blows and we'll see what it does. But I've certainly seen plenty of katanas fail over the years, sometimes from a very simple action, other times after a whole lot of abuse. Matthew Jensen's channel has lots of examples for you to go check out. So there we have it. Plenty of accounts from history of swords breaking across the board. Hope you guys enjoyed. Take care.